This is BBC News. I'm Rachel Schofield. The headlines at 2 o'clock. Boris Johnson indicates the government might be prepared to take military action in Syria without seeking the consent of Parliament.
If the Americans choose to act again and they ask us to help, as I say, I think it would be very difficult to say no.
So we don't need unilateral action, we need to work through the UN, but above all, we need to bend ourselves totally to getting a political settlement in Syria.
The Vice President of the European Commission says the general election will have no effect on Brexit negotiations. New figures show a big rise in violent crime in England and Wales, with knife crime at its highest level for 6 years. How a simple eye test could lead to much earlier detection of glaucoma, a condition which causes irreversible sight loss. Also ahead this hour, switching back to paper, why readers are turning off e-books as publishers enjoy a record year. And NASA's Cassini space probe sends back dramatic data from Saturn after diving through the gap between the planet and its rings. Good afternoon and welcome to BBC News. The Foreign Secretary has suggested Britain could take military action in Syria without a vote in the House of Commons. Boris Johnson said it would be very difficult to say no if President Trump asked for British help in punishing the Syrian regime for another chemical weapons attack. Well, meanwhile, Mr Johnson has also waded into the election campaign for the first time with a highly personal attack on the Labour leader, Jeremy Corbyn. He's called him a mutton-headed old mugwump. Here's our political correspondent, Alex Forsyth.
US missile strikes on a Syrian airfield earlier this month. This was the first direct US action against Syrian government forces, a response to a chemical attack which killed civilians. Today, the Foreign Secretary suggested, if asked, the UK would support such strikes in future, possibly without the approval of Parliament.
If they come to us and ask for our support, whether it's with submarine-based cruise missiles in the Med or whatever it happens to be, as was the case back in 2013, John, it would be, in my view, and I know this is also the view of the Prime Minister, it'd be very difficult for us to say no.
But you'd have to go to the Commons.
I think that needs to be tested. But I think it'd be
you're not sure about that?
I think it would be very difficult for us to say no.
The noes have it. Unlock!
MPs did say no when asked to back airstrikes in Syria by David Cameron in 2013. Today, opposition parties said the process for making such decisions was vital.
A unilateral, illegal intervention would be utterly counterproductive. It seems to me that Boris Johnson is following Tony Blair in that respect.
If the government wants to have parliamentary authority, then they should ask for parliamentary authority, not speculate wildly and we'll jump to whatever President Trump does and support America regardless.
Sources close to Boris Johnson say the position hasn't changed. He hasn't ruled out a parliamentary vote. In this election, defence and foreign policy is one of the dividing lines between the parties. The Tories think for them it's a strength. They're trying to portray Jeremy Corbyn as a threat to national security. In the Sun newspaper today, Boris Johnson launched a personal attack on the Labour leader, calling him a mutton-headed old mugwump who would be calamitous in Downing Street. Campaigning in Essex, Mr Corbyn said they were focused on serious debate, not name-calling. Asked about the possibility of airstrikes in Syria, he said Labour wanted a political solution.
We don't need unilateral action, we need to work through the UN, but above all, we need to bend ourselves totally to getting a political settlement in Syria and allow the inspectors space to work, allow them to make sure we know who did that terrible chemical weapons attack, and also recognise that the inspectors there are already destroying any stocks of chemical weapons that they find.
This campaign will determine who sits in number 10, who gets to make those decisions about policy abroad and at home. Politicians know their vision for the nation's future is vital. Alex Forsyth, BBC News.
Well, let's get more from our chief political correspondent, Vicky Young, who's in Westminster live for us now. Vicky.
Yeah, and it will be interesting to see how much foreign affairs plays in this general election. I think usually people think people vote on issues such as schools and hospitals, and that of course will be very important. But people of course are choosing the future Prime Minister, and these kinds of decisions are very important to people. Let's discuss this a little bit more. I'm joined by the Conservative member of the Foreign Affairs Select Committee, Adam Holloway. Boris Johnson there suggesting it would be very hard to say no to America. There'll be lots of people who feel pretty alarmed about that.
Well, I mean, traditionally, we've always supported the Americans, apart from the Vietnam War. I think we had a few examples where perhaps Tony Blair allowed George W. Bush to drive drunk, where we perhaps didn't cover ourselves in great glory. But, you know, Boris Johnson and Theresa May are smart people, and they'll realise the key thing about violence, about using military force, and that is it's got to be in support of a political objective, a set of political objectives. It's the obvious thing about the use of force. So I very much hope that that is the context in which these comments are made.
And going to that point, Jeremy Corbyn, the Labour leader, saying that actually what will airstrikes do? How will that help? It's got to be a political solution.
Well, he's completely right about that, but he's in absolute la-la land to talk about the UN and weapons inspectors. Look, Assad doesn't listen to the UN. Assad listens essentially to two people, the Iranians, but especially the Russians. And when David Davis and I went and quietly saw Assad this time last year, it was very, very clear to us that this guy realised that he was only in power, that his skin had been saved by the Russian effort. And the Russians are the people keeping him there, and the Russians are the people who can get him out of there. So forget the UN. It's about the Russians, and what we should be doing now is we should be using this window of opportunity when the Russians must be really annoyed with the regime for putting sarin in there the other day, to actually work with the Russians, get a proper political track going that eventually results in Assad and his brother and top cronies leaving, so that there could be some sort of beginning of a political solution.
What about the role of Parliament in all of this? Boris Johnson also suggested there may not need to be a vote. A convention has grown up, hasn't it, in recent years, that Parliament should have a say before action?
Yeah, it has, and I think that's a good thing, and I think I was probably the first person to say it when there was the last vote a few years ago for the chemical attack. But, a Prime Minister also needs to be able to employ the military principle of surprise. So whilst in general I do think it's a good thing that you have parliamentary votes, you must allow a Prime Minister to be able to make a decision on the spot and then perhaps go to Parliament.
Can I just ask you about Boris Johnson and his language today? It's the first time we've seen him in this election campaign, being pretty rude, personal comments about Jeremy Corbyn. Some have said he's demeaning the role and the office of Foreign Secretary.
Well, I didn't see that, but I have to say, some people try to sort of present Boris as if he's some kind of joke. He was a very good mayor of London. I didn't notice him put a foot wrong there. And to be honest, I'm not noticing him put a foot wrong as Foreign Secretary. Boris Johnson realises you've got to have a political settlement in Syria. The last thing you can have is the collapse of that regime, because then all of the territory that we call Syria will be unimaginable chaos for yet more millions of people in the Middle East. He's no fool.
Holloway, thank you very much indeed. So that's the view there, a supporter of the Foreign Secretary. Others say that Theresa May might not have been totally thrilled by his intervention today. He disagrees with her about things like letting students be on the immigration figures. So we'll have to see how many more trips out to the media Boris Johnson makes.
Vicky, thanks very much indeed. Well, as we've been hearing, the Labour leader has been out campaigning in Harlow and has been talking about housing. Labour have pledged to build 1 million homes over 5 years, half of which would be council houses.
This is a key issue in this election. We're not building the houses we should in this country. We're building less than we were at any time since the 1920s. This is terrible. And our pledge is to build 1 million homes over the lifetime of Parliament, half of which will be council and housing association built and be for rent and affordable homes, because we need to have our country properly housed. Young people living in overcrowded places don't do so well in school. Anyone living in housing stress, not knowing how long their tenancy is going to last in the private sector, gets very stressed. And so those are the policies we'll be producing in our manifesto.
The Labour leader, Jeremy Corbyn, there. But the Conservatives say they are the party with a clear plan for affordable housing. So just how do the figures stack up? Well, since the 1970s, there have been, on average, 160,000 new homes built each year in England. A government white paper published in February said the consensus is that we need from 225,000 to 275,000 or more homes per year to keep up with population growth and to tackle years of undersupply. Well, let's stay with all things political because the former London mayoral candidate Zac Goldsmith has been chosen by the Conservatives to stand for Parliament in his old constituency of Richmond Park. Mr Goldsmith, you may remember, was ousted as MP by the Liberal Democrats during a by-election in December. He'd previously left the Conservative Party in protest at the government's backing of a third runway at Heathrow. And the Lib Dems have decided not to contest the Brighton Pavilion seat, currently held by the only Green Party MP, Caroline Lucas. Last week, she called for a progressive alliance, where parties did not put up candidates in some seats to avoid the vote against the Conservatives being split. And worth reminding you, you can find out more about today's election pledges and the very latest on the campaign on our website. That's bbc.co.uk/news. Crime in England and Wales has risen in almost every category, according to the latest statistics. Violent crime is up sharply by 19%. Well, it's the final set of crime figures before the general election. And our Home Affairs correspondent Daniel Sanford has the details.
A brutal attack outside a West Midlands pub last month by half a dozen men who are still being sought by police. It appears to have been a targeted attack using a machete. At a time when there are signs that crime is on the increase in England and Wales, particularly violent crime and crimes involving knives and guns. The number of offences recorded by police last year was up 9%. Worryingly, burglary was up 4% and vehicle crime up 8%, both crimes that had been falling for decades. The Office for National Statistics says some of the increases can be explained by changes in police record keeping.
I think any rises that we're seeing now are genuine, because I think those improvements stabilised a long time ago. And it's not good enough for ONS to keep on saying that they're to do with improved recording. I really think they must be genuine.
But one of the biggest concerns in police forces at the moment is what seems to be a clear rise in knife and gun crime. More people seem to be carrying knives and using them. More guns are being fired. Overall violent crime was up 19% last year. Again, some of that increase can be explained by record-keeping changes, but firearms offences recorded were up 13% and knife offences were up 14%. Though recent figures from hospitals suggested a dip in serious violence-related injuries. Crime expert Tom Gash told me it's probably too early to know why violence is rising, but there are some possible reasons.
The speculations would focus around things that we think might be related to crime, like levels of policing numbers, cuts in youth services may have been a factor. Mental health is becoming a particularly important issue that's raised in public awareness over this election campaign and is incredibly important in relation to crime.
The police recorded crime figures are contradicted by the official crime survey of people's experiences of crime, which appear to be stable. But statisticians believe that survey may be lagging slightly behind. Also out today were separate figures on violence in prison, showing big increase in assaults on staff, self-harm, homicide and suicide. Daniel Sanford, BBC News.
The German Chancellor Angela Merkel says some people in Britain have illusions about the reality of Brexit. She's also insisted that there should be agreement on the UK's divorce bill from the European Union before any negotiations on trade can begin. It comes as ministers from the EU's remaining 27 countries meet in Luxembourg to finalise their negotiating stance on Brexit. Well, earlier our Europe correspondent Damien Grammaticus gave us this update.
Some would see it as tough. Chancellor Merkel said that she simply was laying out what she thought was obvious, and that, she said, was that the UK, once it's outside the EU, will be a third country, will not have the same benefits. And I think what she meant by those illusions was addressing the idea that the UK can negotiate a deal with the same kind of access as it currently enjoys. And that's also what we've heard here today in Luxembourg. The 27 countries, ministers here, very quickly have signed off on the negotiating guidelines. They said that certain core things mattered in that. There would be no special access to the single market, no individual deals for single sectors like banking, and the bill too, that the costs, the liabilities the UK has built up would have to continue to be paid beyond even Brexit. Interestingly, too, the deputy to Jean-Claude Juncker, Frans Timmermans, vice president of the European Commission, he said on the way in that what happens in the UK election will have no influence at all on the EU's side, on the negotiating position it is now adopting. He said even the size of a majority of a new government would have no bearing. The EU's position, he said, would be determined by the EU's interests seen by its 27 remaining countries. These will now be signed off at the weekend on Saturday, and the EU will then formally be ready to begin talks.
Damien Grammaticus there. Well, after the meeting, the Irish Minister for European Affairs, Dara Murphy, said there was a strong consensus among the remaining 27 members about the direction of the Brexit negotiations.
Well, as you know, the draft guidelines set out the principles of what we seek to achieve. There are some differences between what the UK would seek to achieve about the sequencing, about the discussions about the future relationship, differences between the European Union position and the UK. But I'm sure they can be addressed now once the two negotiating teams sit down opposite each other. I mean, again, to re-stress, the emphasis here was on having an orderly process and to agreeing that that we will work to sort out the issue of citizens' rights clearly, the issue of what the terms, financial terms of the settlement will be, and from an Irish point of view, from a Northern Irish point of view, and I suppose for both of us on our two islands, good strong consensus that we must work to ensure the peace agreement that the people of both islands have worked so hard to achieve, that is preserved. And I suppose that's the one area where the starting position between London, Brussels, Dublin, Belfast, where we are all on the same page, and I think peace on our islands sits above every other concern we have.
Dara Murphy there. It's at 17 minutes past 2. Let's remind you of our headlines here on BBC News. Boris Johnson suggests Britain could help America take further action in Syria in the event of another chemical weapons attack. The Vice President of the European Commission says June's general election will have no effect on Brexit negotiations. And there's been a rise in the number of crimes recorded by police in England and Wales, with violent crimes increasing.